The Witcher 3 Next Gen Edition is here, which means that I'm back to update my build. There was a lot of balance changes that were not included in the patch notes that really changes the combat system a lot, to be honest. Finally, some abilities that didn't work previously, like Hunter Instinct, have been fixed. Euphoria have gotten nerfed because Acquired Tolerance isn't as good anymore. The resistances for all the Witcher School's armor also got tanked a bit, so there's a lot to uncover here. I will not go over all of the changes. This video will more just present my build and explain why I think it's the best build in The Witcher 3 currently. Also, as always, this is my personal opinion. One of the reasons why I think this build is the most fun is because it caters more into the swordplay aspect of things. It has incredible high damage numbers, critical hit chance, and all that good stuff. But since I said before, Euphoria have got a nerf, other mutagens are not totally useless compared to Euphoria like it was before, so you can actually make sign builds work. Ard and Jurden especially have gotten pretty major buffs, so yeah, if you want to experiment with that, you can definitely do so. I might make a video about it in the future. Either way, without further ado, let's get this over with. When it comes to this build Silver Sword, the answer has always been obvious, and it still is. Erendite is by far the best Silver Sword for any type of Witcher 3 related build. The fact that you get a guaranteed critical hit when it's at max charge just makes the sword amazing, and the damage numbers obviously scales very nicely as well. Also, if you need any help with leveling up Erendite, don't forget to check out my other video where I cover 3 really good methods to level up your sword faster and more reliable. For the Steel Sword, I've chosen the Toussaint's Knight Steel Sword again. The critical hit damage bonus and the critical hit chance is just amazing on this sword. Obviously, no matter if you're in New Game Plus or in a fresh playthrough, the sword will always be very high level as well, so the damage numbers will be good. However, I have another recommendation to do now that Winter's Blade and Blade from the Bits have gotten buffed. In my opinion, it's fine to run with Winter's Blade as well, especially if you're way above the level requirements for when you pick up the Toussaint's Knight Steel Sword. The Winter's Blade is probably just going to have way better damage numbers. However, the critical hit chance is not there, and the critical hit damage bonus is also way better on the Toussaint's Knight Steel Sword. So if you can run with that sword, and if it's around your level, I would recommend that. Otherwise, I would pick up the Winter's Blade because it has slightly better stats than the Blade from the Bits that also got buffed. Moving over to the armor, I've made some changes since my last build. Basically, the main reason behind that is I had to scrape together a few extra toxicity points from the armor sets to make my build work, basically. So starting off with the chest armor, we got the legendary Manticore armor because of those toxicity points, but also because of the 30% critical hit damage bonus, which is very nice. For the trousers, the same thing applies here. The toxicity is very nice, but also the 6% critical hit chance is nothing to scoff at either. And for the boots, we're using the Manticore boots as well. The toxicity points is just vital for my build to work. You guys will understand soon enough. And lastly, for the gauntlets, we're using the Nilfgaardian Guardsman gauntlets. These gauntlets are the best in the game by far. The reason behind that is because they have 50% critical hit damage bonus, which is just amazing. As I said before, the build revolves around a lot of critical hit numbers, and therefore the 50% bonus to that is just amazing. If you feel like you're taking too much damage with this setup and want more resistances, then you can swap the chest piece for the Ursine armor for slightly better resistances, but that also means that you'll have to swap the Nilfgaardian Guardsman gauntlets for the Manticore ones, because we're still in need of those toxicity points. Here's a summary going over the steel and silver swords that we just talked about, as well as all the armor pieces. Coming up next is the ability points, the mutagens, and all that good stuff, so stay tuned. If you're wondering when this build is available for you in your playthrough, then check this out. In total, you need 49 ability points to be able to use all the skills I'm using, as well as the extra 5 points for Euphoria. This number is very low compared to my previous build, and that's just because in this patch they changed how ability points work. Before you could spend 5 ability points per skill, now the maximum is 3. Most of the abilities haven't been nerfed in any kind of way like that, just that the third tier is equal to what the previous 5th tier was. And because of that, the build will be available much earlier in a playthrough. So assuming that you don't find any places of power throughout your playthrough, I mean, you do you, the build will be available at level 50 because you don't get an ability point for the first level. But for every place of power that you found, the build will obviously be available 1 level earlier per place of power. Okay, it's time to look at the ability points, starting with the combat ones. Here you will be spending 21 ability points, mainly covering fast and strong attacks. The fast attack skills are the 3 first one: Muscle Memory, Precise Blows, and Whirl. All of these skills are great. Muscle Memory for the increased damage, Precise Blows for the increased critical hit damage and critical hit chance, and Whirl because apart from it being a incredibly fun ability, it's also an incredibly strong one, especially when fighting grouped enemies. Looking at our strong attacks, we also have the 3 first ones here: Strength Training, Crushing Blows, and Rend. Strength Training and Crushing Blows have the same arguments as Muscle Memory and Precise Blows. And we obviously got Rend in this build as well because it's an incredible useful tool, like especially against beefy enemies or enemies with shields and that kind of stuff, and it obviously outputs a massive amount of damage as well. Both Whirl and Rend makes the build very interesting and fun, and I'm not really a fan of those builds that, especially combat builds that don't include those 2 skills, because it just makes the combat way more intriguing to me at least. You may wonder why I haven't chosen the final skills in the fast or strong attack tree, and it's just because Crippling Strikes and Sunder Armor are not as powerful and useful as the other skills in my opinion. Crippling Strikes I feel like you should almost never use. It's just almost a detrimental skill or borderline not useful at all. Sunder Armor is useful, but as with every build you have to compromise, and Sunder Armor I decided to not keep in here. It's a useful skill, so if you want to swap it with something, you can definitely do so, but this is, as I said before, this is my opinion of the best skills that you can put in. The final skill in the combat tree is Razor Focus, and we're using Razor Focus because it gives us 1 adrenaline point when entering combat, which is useful, but the main thing is that we generate adrenaline points or APs 30% faster, which is just huge. When we get more into the alchemy abilities, you guys will understand why adrenaline points are important and what we're using them for, so stay tuned for that. The same thing with the armor applies here as well. If you feel like you're taking way too much damage or like losing too many adrenaline points, then Resolve is obviously a great skill, and you can definitely swap that with either Muscle Memory or Strength Training. It obviously decreases your damage slightly, but it also makes it more forgiving if you're taking that damage, and maintaining high adrenaline points is going to be easier. Speaking of the alchemy abilities, you might wonder where all the sign abilities are, and there are none in this build. This build revolves around critical hits, high damage numbers, swordplay, and that kind of stuff, and there's just no room to implement signs really. You could maybe implement like Magic Trap or something fun, and I know Art and Jordan have gotten buffed, but yeah. I tend to not like to play around with signs that much. It's fun for an hour or two, but after that each encounter just becomes pretty repetitive, and therefore that's what we're going with here. So starting with oil preparation. In oil preparation we got Protective Coating, Fixative, and Hunter Instinct. All 3 skills are very useful, starting with Protective Coating, who got a nerf from 25 down to 15%, which is a pretty significant nerf, but 15% is still a good chunk of damage that you're getting. However, 15% is still a good chunk of percentage that's getting negated, and I find the skill very useful, considering that the build is quite squishy in general. This is nice to have, to be able to block some incoming damage in case you take any hits. Fixative got a pretty big buff from before the next gen update. Before it was just blade oils didn't wear off, which was kind of cool, but also just not really worth to use as an ability. However, now in the next gen edition, you can apply 3 different oils to a sword at a time, and they do not wear off. This basically means that you do not need to care about your steel sword oils anymore, because you'll just put Hangman's oil and the beast oil on there, which is an amazing quality of life thing to have. However, if you're not that interested in the quality of life thing and want to maximize the build even more, then you can swap Fixative for Sunder Armor to get even higher damage numbers. We also got Hunter Instinct here as well. Finally this ability works, and we'll make the most of it and use this ability. It's an amazing ability. You can see here also where all those adrenaline points went to, so when we're at max adrenaline points, it gives 100% critical hit damage against the targeted enemy type, which is amazing. And yeah, as I said, this skill finally works, so we're definitely gonna take advantage of that. Moving over to Mutation, we got Acquired Tolerance and Synergy. I don't think there's too much to say here. Even though Acquired Tolerance got nerfed, it's still a very useful skill, especially when you're playing around with Alchemy and Euphoria and that kind of stuff. It's just necessary, really. Synergy is still Synergy. It's amazing to be able to boost those mutagens by 50%, so we're gonna keep that in. Moving over to Trial of the Grasses, we got Killing Spree and Fast Metabolism. Fast Metabolism is useful because it makes it easier to play around with potions. Once we go over Decoctions and Potions and how that plays out with the build, you guys will understand why we got that here. Killing Spree is also a great ability. It basically means that if your toxicity is above 0 for each opponent you killed, it increases the critical hit chance by 30% for the duration of that fight, which means that it's very easy to get above 100% critical hit chance with this build. When it comes to the general abilities, it's quite simple. I'm using 2 of them. It's the same as last time. Using Cat's-Skull techniques for the critical hit damage and fast attack damage. Don't forget to put Levity on your chest piece, because otherwise this is going to be useless. And we're also using Metabolic Control. Those 30 toxicity points are vital for the Euphoria build to work. Speaking of Euphoria, that will obviously be our mutation for this build, and that's why we needed all those toxicity points from the Manticore set, as well as Metabolic Control and Acquired Tolerance. I know there's some other mutations going around now that Euphoria got nerfed, but in my opinion, Euphoria is still the best build out there. Like, I'm sorry to say it, they nerfed it, but it's still at the top. It's definitely much closer. I think Metamorphosis, if you're playing that game where you only decide to craft a few decoctions that you want, then you can definitely abuse that, and that build is pretty strong. I've also played around with Bloodbath. Bloodbath is like pretty equivalent to Euphoria. It's just for Bloodbath to get any value, you can't take any hits, which obviously makes it harder, right? Especially if you're fighting grouped enemies and that kind of stuff. I mean, even if you're the most talented Witcher player in the world, like, sometimes you're going to get hit, right? Even if you're spamming Quen and whatever. That's one downside. And then secondly, for the damage rampant to be equivalent to what you get with Euphoria, you need to hit 30 consecutive hits without taking any damage, and in most fights that's not going to happen. And remember, all those hits up to number 30, you're gonna have a lower attack percentage gain from the mutation compared to Euphoria. Obviously after that you can get more. Bloodbath caps out at 250%, which is higher than Euphoria's. In my opinion, you're just not going to reach that level that many times, and therefore I've chosen Euphoria above Bloodbath. Finally, we'll just compare Euphoria to Piercing Cold as well, because I know some people think Piercing Cold is very strong, and yeah, Piercing Cold is strong, but you have to take into account that Piercing Cold actually got nerfed going into next gen edition. It's not a major nerf, but it got nerfed, and Euphoria was always a lot better than Piercing Cold before the update, and it's still better. Piercing Cold is definitely really fun to play around with, and especially since Ard and Jaredin got buffed, I feel like it kind of counters like the Piercing Cold nerf out. So Piercing Cold is definitely a good shout. I'll probably do a build on it in the future, but as for now, I mean, Euphoria is just more consistent. Starting with the build's utility, I'll just cover the bombs real quick. There's not really too much to think about here. The only bomb you'll see me using basically is going to be Northern Wind. I think that's the best bomb in the game. It's the most useful one. I put the Dancing Star here as well just because it's quite fun to use, and it's actually okay to use against group enemies, especially humans, to be able to set them on fire, keep a few of the enemies away from the fight for a few seconds, so that could be helpful. But I mean, as I said, I think the Northern Wind is the clear winner here. So if you're planning to use any bombs, that's definitely my recommendation. Okay, let's talk about this build's decoctions. Probably the most vital area of the build, or at least one of them. We got 4 decoctions: the Troll decoction, the Chimera decoction, the Wyvern decoction, and the Succubus decoction. As you can see on your screen, all these 4 decoctions make up a combined 200 toxicity points, which is very good for the Euphoria mutation to work. The Troll and the Chimera decoction is used to regen vitality, which is useful because we will take some toxicity damage. In case you take a blow, you will always have both of them to regen your health. It also makes it easier to use potions because you don't need to use that swallow potion as often. You can more focus on Thunderbolt or Toniol or Blizzard potion or something like that. The Wyvern decoction is actually getting slept on a bit. I think it's a pretty useful decoction, especially if you feel confident with the dodge mechanics and the ability to spam Quent so that you don't take that much damage, because in that case your damage will ramp up over time and it's very useful in these long fights. The same goes for the Succubus decoction. The Succubus decoction doesn't matter if you take any damage. It's slightly worse than a Thunderbolt potion. The maximum cap of a Succubus decoction is 30%, but it's still a 30% increase, and I find it pretty useful. Just be aware, as you can see on your screen as well, that there's only 2 Succubus in the game, so you'll have to decide to kill one of them, because otherwise you cannot craft a decoction. If you're interested in swapping any decoctions, I would advise you to swap either the Wyvern or the Succubus decoction. If you want to feel more tanky, the Aracas decoction is always good. The Ancient Lesson is also a good shout. It basically means that for every sign you cast, your stamina regen will increase for the remainder of that fight. There's a few other good shouts, but these 4 are in my opinion the most useful, at least to my playstyle. But as I said, if you feel like you're taking too much damage or want to swap something around, if you want to swap a decoction and be able to use more potions freely, then that's completely up to you. Well, talking about the potions, here we are. As you can see on the screen, I put up a toxicity meter. We got the 200 toxicity filled with decoctions, and then we have 29 toxicity points to play around with for potions. And that might seem low, and yeah, it is pretty low, but matter of fact is that we have fast metabolism, so we can pop multiple potions per fight without any issues. The 2 potions I tend to use the most are definitely Thunderbolt and Toniol. Thunderbolt for the increased damage and Toniol for the increased stamina regen, of course. The stamina regen is useful because you will be spamming some Quen, and the Thunderbolt is always nice to get that extra attack power. On rare occasions, I will pop a Swallow Potion because I feel like I need it for the increased healing, but apart from that, Thunderbolt and Toniol is what you will mostly play around with this build. Remember, you're regenning health constantly from the Troll decoction, and you're getting health back while dealing damage as well with the Chimera decoction. Another good shout is obviously the Blizzard potions. However, we're not playing around delayed recovery here, so basically the biggest weakness for the Blizzard potion is its short duration, and you can definitely get around that by playing with delayed recovery and making sure that the Blizzard potion stays up all the time. However, that's not really what we're doing here, and one of the main reasons I prefer fast metabolism above delayed recovery in this build is because it's way easier to manage. All you need to do is pop your 4 decoctions, and then whenever you enter combat, you'll pop 1 or 2 of these potions, and then you're done. You don't need to think about constantly pressing one of your hotkeys. That's just not a thing in this build, and you'll still get really good damage numbers. Finally, we'll take a look at some stats. First of all, I just want to mention that comparing stats between builds is not really that representative, because builds revolve around different numbers and the stats will not always give the entire picture. For example, right now on your screen, some of the abilities that we're using, like Hunter Instinct, Killing Spree, and that kind of stuff is not taken into account. And the Succubus or the Wyvern decoction is also not taken into account because we're not in combat right now. But yeah, here are just the base numbers when you have 4 decoctions and 1 potion active. Silver sword damage is around 11k and steel sword damage is around 9.5, 10k. You can get these numbers slightly higher by maxing out your erendite and all of that good stuff as well. Also, when looking at the critical hit chances for both the silver and steel sword, you'll realize that they are quite low, honestly, and just be aware that doesn't take into account that we have erendite, a sword that gets 10% critical hit chance for every hit, and it reaches 100% when it's maxed charge. The steel sword will obviously also increase with hunter instinct and all that good stuff, so it's very easy to get above 100% critical hit chance. Just make sure that you're using the right oil, and yeah, it shouldn't really be a problem. Honestly, the biggest thing to take away from this stats thing is probably just the toxicity points. Make sure you're around 229. Make sure you at least have 225 so that you can pop a Thunderbolt potion. Also, taking a look at the armor here, you can see that resistance levels are actually quite decent, considering that there has been so many nerfs to the Witcher Skull's armor's resistances and that kind of stuff, and the fact that protective coating got nerfed as well and stuff. The resistances are quite decent, but yeah, just be aware that you will be quite squishy in this build. Also be aware that these are the base numbers. Once in combat, this doesn't take into account your usage of rend or attacking people from behind and that kind of stuff, so these numbers can get insanely high. After this, I will show you some gameplay, and I have some footage of over 100k damage, which you actually can reach pretty consistently with this build, which is mental. Well, that finally concludes this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and as I said in the beginning, I want to be clear with that this is my opinion. I know that you can play this game in many different ways, but this build just combines what I think makes the game enjoyable and also does it in a really strong way. Coming up is a great summary as well as some gameplay footage if you want to see some insane damage numbers. Thank you for watching, take care and stay safe.